Welcome to the book of Romans. My name is Phil Leach, and I have the privilege of working with you as you engage with this book. This, as I'm sure you're aware, is considered at least one of the greatest of the Apostle Paul's letter, if not the greatest, and people have made different claims and different quotes about its excellence over the years. One has said this is undoubtedly the greatest of the Apostle Paul's letters. Another, the most systematic in form, because you can see the unfolding argument that the Apostle Paul has as he's making a case for his gospel. Some have said it's the weightiest in substance as he deals with many profound issues. Someone else has said this letter has made a deep impression on each succeeding age, and I think we can surely see how that's true. Someone else, no book in the world has been more carefully or diligently studied. I'm not sure how you know that, but again, it's not hard to see at least some truth in that. Someone else, the most profound work in existence, and someone else, at every word, we feel ourselves face to face with the unfathomable. Now, this last quote is actually a little troubling because we want to engage with it. Certainly, it's a work of a tremendous depth, but it was these kind of comments that actually, in my own journey, I felt kind of intimidated to ever teach Romans. I became a leader of the School of Biblical Studies here in the UK in 1985, and as a school leader, of course, you get to choose who teaches the different books. That's one of the responsibilities, to set up the schedule. And I would always have someone else who I felt was more qualified to teach this book. And as I continued with that, I came across something that I read, and it had quite an impact on me. The commentator said this: Paul wrote his message in the first place for average people, not theologians. And as we engage with the book of Romans, we need to remember that. The book of Romans isn't a systematic theology book that was written to scholars in Rome. It was actually written to everyday people. And many of them would not have had a big education. Some of them probably did. But there were people there who were part of the church, and he was trying to communicate things. And I think we can agree that he wrote this in the first place. It wasn't for theologians, it was for average people, and he wanted to be understood. And of course, the foundation of inductive study is asking the question, firstly, what did this mean to those original readers or listeners as the letter would have been read to them? And it's good for us as we come to this book just to remind ourselves of that. And the quote, the commentator went on to say, certainly he saw further into the things of God than most of us. And that's true. We have no problem with that. But we can still look in the same direction. And even if we miss some of the details, we can get the main lie of the landscape of what he's trying to say. And so as you do your studies, let's remember that. He was speaking to people like you and me, and he wanted to be understood. And I think as we come, there's some concepts which may be different in today's understanding, and I want to explore that with you. In fact, the way I will approach Romans, I won't spend a lot of time looking at the easier passages. There's some passages which are straightforward. They don't need much explanation. You can do that in your own study. but what I want to do is help you see the main flow of the argument. Sometimes he goes off on one or two rabbit trails. We can look at that too. But the main point is that we get the heart of the message of the gospel. He starts with that massive declaration, doesn't he? I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God to salvation to those who have faith. And then he unpacks that, and it is a gospel of such joy and such grace and such wonder. And that's what I want to be sure we go away with, or understanding in a way, hopefully in a new, deeper way, the love of God that he has for us. Okay, so as you know in your studies here in the online SBS, you know that letters were written for a purpose. There was not a time whereby the apostle of Paul, or any author actually, sat down one day and just said, I'm going to write a bit of the Bible. I'm going to, I need to write a bit of the Bible. But the marvelous thing about Scripture is that every book and every letter is written out of an occasion. And as we understand that occasion, we're able to have greater insight into what is written, why it was written, what it meant, and therefore what it means. And so what is the occasion? Well, there's a number of occasions, but I'd just like to mention a couple which really seem to be those that have the most substance. And one of the occasions is what we could call the missionary occasion. Now, this actually was the occasion that was presented on my very first school I led here in England. We had a really gifted Bible teacher of national recognition. It was a privilege to have him. And he presented this as the reason for the letter to the church in Rome. And it really comes to the things that the Apostle Paul says in chapter 15, how he's preparing the church for his visit. And if you turn to chapter 15, he says how, verse 19, so that from Jerusalem as far round as Illyricum, I have fully proclaimed the good news of Christ. Now, you know from Acts that he had really spent a lot of time, 3 missionary journeys by the time he wrote Romans. He was in his 3rd missionary journey at this time, and he had pioneered churches in the leading cities in the Mediterranean basin, the northeast of the Mediterranean basin. And what he wanted to do was then to move on. And he says, I've been taken up, I've preached the gospel from Jerusalem all the way round to Illyricum. And he's as a pioneer apostle, verse 20, thus it is my ambition to proclaim the good news where Christ has already, where Christ has not already been named, so that I do not build on someone else's foundation. And so he explains that he had been hindered to coming and visiting the church in Rome. And the reason was he was busy with his missionary activities, as we know from the book of Acts. But he says, verse 23 of chapter 15, but now, with no further place for me in these regions, I desire, as I have for many years, to come to you when I go to Spain. And for I do hope to see you on my journey. And then I want you to notice these words in 24, because this is key to this understanding. He says, to be sent on by you once I've enjoyed your company for a little while. Now, as you've followed the expansion of the gospel through the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts, you will know that Antioch there of Syria was like his home base. That is where he was sent out from, and that's where he came back to each time. And that was the base of operations, if you like, of the Gentile mission. But of course, Antioch is a very, very long way from Spain. And the thought is that he was looking for a new base of operations. And as he was wanted to move further west with the gospel, he was looking for Rome to be that new base, and to have them be a supporting church. And the understanding is that this phrase in verse 24, that I want to be sent on by you, is a phrase that is asking for their support. It would be financial support as well as any other kind of support for his missionary events. And the idea is, the point of the letter to the Roman church was the fact that he was laying out his gospel so that they would understand the gospel that he preached. And it was as if he was saying to them, this is the gospel I preach, and I want to move on to Spain, and I want you to support me. The point that our teacher made all those years ago was that today, when missionaries go out, what they do is they often give a report of the great things they've done. They may talk about the number of people saved, or churches planted, or people healed, or people ministered to. But the Apostle Paul wasn't doing that. Certainly he could do that. Of course, he could have a really great missionary newsletter with all of the things that he had accomplished. But rather, he was saying, support me on the basis of the message that I'm preaching. And that is the purpose of the letter. Now, of course, I've reflected on this over the years, and this is been quite a popular understanding. The problems I have with this is there does seem to be specific arguments going on in the letter that we will look at. He seems to be very specifically addressing Jews at different times and Gentiles at others, and then he's calling them to account in different areas that we will see. And so it seems to be more than just a presentation of a gospel, that like there's more going on in this letter. But more than that, as we look at the Apostle Paul in what we have learned about him in the book of Acts, in other letters, the Apostle Paul isn't someone who I think would present his gospel for a church to approve of or disapprove. In fact, you go to Galatians, and in Galatians the apostle says very simply, who's bewitched you? The gospel that you're embracing is a wrong gospel. He's saying what you need to do is change what you believe, and believe what I'm teaching you, and remember what I've taught you. And likewise, it seems to me to be very unlikely that the Apostle Paul would present the gospel to a church that he's not visited to say, do you approve of this message? Now, certainly he is asking for their support. It seems that he has worked through the main argument. He's applied that very practically in chapters 12 following through to halfway through 15. And then he's bringing his letter to a close. And as he brings his letter to a close, he's explaining to them again why he has been delayed in visiting them. He actually does this in chapter 1, you'll notice. But he does it again, and he also lets them know about his plans. So certainly he is asking them to receive him, and then he will spend time with them, and he certainly wants them to send him on to Spain for this to be a base of operations. But what I'm going to suggest to you, that the purpose of the letter was much more than this. Now, just to say that there's been other suggestions too. Some have said that he's written this simply out of love and friendship for the people there, to let them know he's coming. And I think we can agree with that. That is certainly one of the things that is happening in this letter. Chapter 1 and chapter 15, 16 would really affirm that. But again, is that the whole purpose of the letter? I think it's more than that. He, interestingly enough, asked for their prayers for his visit to Jerusalem. When you study Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, you'll see how he's actually taken up an offering. This letter was written on his third missionary journey. It seems that he was in Achaia, which is southern Greece. He was spending the winter there. People didn't travel in the winter around the Mediterranean. Often when he was traveling west to east, he would go by vessel, by ship, and no one would travel in the winter because of the storms and how dangerous it was on the ocean. So he was spending the winter there in Corinth and the third missionary journey, and he was also taking up this offering that's mentioned at the end of 1 Corinthians, and it's mentioned in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9, and as you're probably aware, 2 Corinthians was written just a few months earlier, just before the letter to the Roman church. And so for some reason he was concerned about whether he would be received in Jerusalem, whether the offering would be received, but he had a real passion to care for the poor that were there in Jerusalem. And he asked for prayer that offering would be received. Now, you know from the book of Acts that it was on that particular visit to Jerusalem that he eventually got arrested. And he spent 2 years in Caesarea. And then because of the whole plots of the Jewish leaders there in Jerusalem, their desire to kill him, he had to appeal to Caesar. And so we know that he got to Rome. He did get there, but he didn't go the way he was expecting to. He ended up being taken there as a prisoner, and he was in house arrest, which meant, of course, he was able to receive and entertain people. We read that in the last chapter of the book of Acts, and there's no doubt he would have spent time with the believers there as well during that period of time. And so we know he's letting them know his future plans. He's asking for prayer, but there seems to be something else going on here that would have required such a beautiful unfolding of the gospel, explanation of the gospel. And the question is, what is that? Now, some have just suggested that he had a few months to winter there in Achaia, and so he decided to write his theology. And so they would say it is a theology book. But we see that, again, he's talking to specific people, specific groups, and it seems to be far more personal and engaging with the church in Rome rather than just a systematic theology. And so what was the reason for the letter? I want to suggest that the letter of Paul to the Roman church was written for the same reason all of his letters were written. In other words, it was a pastoral letter. He wrote this letter out of a pastoral heart. And one of the things you may have noticed in your studies so far is when you've asked the observation question, the who question. Because as you ask that question through this letter, what you see is at times he's talking very specifically to Gentiles and to Gentile believers. Chapter 11, he says it very specifically. He says it in chapter 11:13, now I speak to you Gentiles. And most of what he says in the rest of that chapter is specifically to the Gentiles. And he tells them not to boast, and he explains things. In another portion in chapter 2, he says, this is chapter 2:17, but if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law, and he seems to be speaking specifically to Jews, and you can trace this throughout, and if you haven't done so, I would encourage you to do this, to be asking the who question, because clearly he's talking to Gentiles sometimes, and then he's talking to the Jews sometimes, and then he speaks about them together. How there's a oneness, or they stand side by side before God in different areas, and this particular focus, I think, is really significant to help us understand the dynamics of what was going on in the church in Rome, but also at the heart of the Apostle Paul. Now, all of Paul's letters, I think we can say, are written about specific situations. Even the circular letter of Ephesians was written so that the churches there in Asia Minor would be strengthened and understand the truth, to stand against the kind of heresy that the church in Colossae was knowing, which was so close to all of them. And so you get this understanding of the Apostle Paul being what some have called a task theologian. In other words, it wasn't abstract theology, but rather it was teaching into a situation to bring a correction in belief system and lifestyle, so that people would be able to engage with and enjoy and fully appreciate the gospel and the salvation that they have from God. And so I'm suggesting that, like the other letters of the Apostle Paul, this letter was written from a pastoral perspective to bring a correction. And if that's not the case, then Romans is a pretty big exception to all of his other letters. But I think we see that indeed this is the case. And so what is the issue that he's dealing with? Well, the evidence, as we look at the people he's addressing, and his emphasis on the Jew, the Gentile, and then the oneness between them, it would seem that there has been a division in the church in Rome between Jew and Gentile. He speaks about how when it comes to sin, how the wrath of God is revealed, and he talks about idolatry, which is the sin of a Gentile, particularly there in Rome, and the whole Roman world. But then in chapter 2 he talks about the Jews, how the Jews had the law, but they didn't keep the law. And then in chapter 3, that well-known scripture, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And the context here, as you've noticed, I'm sure, is Jew and Gentile. The all is both Jew and Gentile have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And God's means of salvation is the same for both. And when it comes to Abraham, Abraham is the father of those who are not circumcised and those who are circumcised. And he spends time in chapter 4 emphasizing that Abraham is the father of both. He's the father of those who have faith, whether they're circumcised or not, i.e. whether they're Gentiles or Jews or not. And you'll notice this all the way through. And then he applies that, which we're going to look at in a short while at the end. And so the working hypothesis, if you like, the suggestion I'm making is that the thrust of this book is written to bring a unity in the church. And we'll look then at at the historical circumstances which probably led to this kind of division. But knowing the Apostle Paul, knowing that he has firstly, he is a Pharisee of the Pharisees, a Jew of the Jews, how he loved his people, yet he was called to the Gentiles. He was an apostle for the Gentiles. So that being the case, it makes such a lot of sense that the fact that there will be division between Jew and Gentile in the church in Rome, it will be something that will be deeply on his heart. And he would have a real desperation to try and bring about that unity and to bring about such a remarkable letter to that end.